Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme today we'll be discussing the transatlantic fallout between the United States, Britain and Europe over the continual war in Ukraine, and certainly what it means to have a ceasefire or peace in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia. And we'll be asking, with this a transatlantic rift growing between President Trump and Europe, does this mean the demise of NATO? And in this programme today, I'm joined by Major General, retired Tim Cross, and Melanie Symonds from Hart Newspapers. Tim, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the programme, and I know that you've been a very busy man over the last few days. You've written a column piece for the Sunday Sun, you've appeared in GB News, you've also appeared on Premier Radio and also LBC Radio and the BBC, and now you're on Politics Today on Revelation TV, so thank you for joining us.
Not at all.
And Tim, just give us your perspective on why it's so important to give moral clarity at this time, and particularly to speak up for our armed forces, particularly in the media, to educate the media and our politicians about the security threats we face, particularly the threat from Russia and the threat that Russia poses to Europe.
Yeah, well, we always live in interesting times. It's one of those great comments, isn't it? But I think the moment we're living in a period of real uncertainty. If I ever wrote a book, I'd call it Comfortable with Chaos. We're living in chaotic times, and it's quite difficult keeping track of what's going on. But I think from a military point of view, we ask our military to go on these operations around the world, and at the end of the day, they have to be prepared to fight and, if necessary, lay down their lives. So in terms of what we're looking at here, talking about deploying British military or NATO troops or whatever it's going to look like in the peace agreement, we need to remember at the end of the day, there will be soldiers on the ground having to engage with this. And in the way that Ukrainian soldiers are engaging even as we speak, under threat from Russia and casualties and so on. So, trying to bring some clarity, understanding, ask some difficult questions, and making sure that our leaders, particularly our Prime Minister and the Cabinet, don't take these decisions lightly, which, I don't think they will, but nonetheless, it's important that we continue to have that conversation.
Absolutely. And Melanie, it's great to have you back on Politics Day, particularly with the General. So do you want to share with us, for any viewers who haven't got the latest edition of Hart Newspaper, how they can get a hold of a copy?
Well, you're in it, Simon, as you know, on page 14.
You have to get it then.
And
only on page 40, all right.
Yeah, the main theme which the Lord gave me was about the importance of siding with Israel for the church at this point, and it is an absolutely key issue because the Lord judges the nations according to how they treat Israel, particularly opposite today as well. And so we've got articles which are still current, such as is the Sea of Ian crisis, and also about the local councils, is democracy under threat, and all the county councils which have been applying to postpone elections so that they can merge into huge authorities. And we've got a wonderful testimony from Anthony Whelan, who I think is going to be on a Revelation programme about how Jesus visited him in his bedsit when he was a Southend down and out.
Very good, very good. And you've got a new edition coming out very soon. Tim, could you unpack for us a lot of the confusion surrounding the war in the Ukraine, especially now that President Trump wants to end the conflict and he's putting pressure on the Ukraine. And according to my notes here, that President Zelensky is not currently wanting to give up territory. He wants to ensure that Ukraine is part of NATO and wants American security guarantees. But Trump is angry at the fact that the American taxpayer has had to pay over $250 billion to protect Ukraine and to protect Europe.
Yeah, well, it's clearly, events are unfurling hour by hour, really, over the last week or so. I do have to say that I think the visit of President Zelensky was a disaster for all sorts of reasons. I happen to believe, I've slowly come to the conclusion that actually he was ambushed. It was a very unusual press conference, and it's very interesting to see how Trump is fronting up these press conferences. I think our Prime Minister did a great job when he was there, but But I think Zelensky was put in a really difficult position, and he ended up rather like rabbits in the headlights. It was really difficult to know, I think, how he could respond to what was going on. But I think, we need to go back. Let's go back to the beginning of this. A sovereign nation has been invaded by another sovereign nation. And the US, the UK and others signed up to an agreement back in 1994 saying that they would guarantee Ukraine's borders. And that's the heart of this whole conversation. We mustn't lose sight of that. And that led to Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons and everything that flowed from that. Now, President Trump clearly is only doing what he said he was going to do. He's trying to produce some sort of peace treaty. But I have to say, when you look at what's happening now in this relationship between US and the UK and Europe, as you've alluded to in your opening shot, if I was President Putin, if we were President Putin, why would we want to go to any negotiations at this stage? We can sit back and watch as NATO is imploding. And I don't know what the President's view is about what he's been talking about with Putin. But clearly he believes Zelensky is stopping him, allowing him to make the progress that he wants to make on these peace talks. But President Zelensky, understandably, is not prepared to sit around a table and just sign away half of his country. I mean, I think it's maybe not an exact example, but if you imagine 1942, President Roosevelt ringing up Churchill and saying, I think you're going to have to make peace with Germany. We're going to stop giving you all these weapons. We're going to stop the Lend-Lease agreements. You're going to have to make peace with Germany. And quite understandably and rightly, I think Churchill would have said, well, thanks very much, but no thanks. And Zelensky is coming from a position as a president of Ukraine where he's trying to hold out for his nation and hold firm to his requirements. I don't actually think he will secure what he wants. I don't think he will regain the Crimea. I don't think Ukraine will become part of NATO. I think he'll be very lucky if he's able to regain any of the lost territory. But you can understand why he's trying to hold firm. Now, where we are today, if I'm brutally honest about this, I think in the end, Zelensky may well have to resign because this relationship with Trump is clearly broken down. And if we're going to see any progress in the future, I think it's going to have to be a fresh start.
That's very serious. But also, I think going back to that press conference, Zelensky was making the point to J.D. Vance that it was Russia using their proxies. It took the Donbass region back in 2014. Then, under President Trump's leadership, they signed a ceasefire agreement in 2019. And then, of course, 3 years later, President Putin relegated on that ceasefire agreement and then invaded the Ukraine. So from Zelensky's perspective, it's like, well, what's the point of signing a peace treaty now, knowing that in a few years' time, that Putin could invade the Ukraine again, or worse, invade the Baltic states or Eastern Europe?
Yeah, which is why he's so insistent that if there is going to be some sort of peace agreement, he needs security guarantees. And we all know that without the US backstop, whatever words one wants to use that have been bandied around over the last few days, that is not going to be easy to provide. And we can come back to what can Europe do on their own, perhaps a bit later.
And Melanie, share your thoughts on that incredible dramatic scenes that we saw in the Oval Office last week with the row breaking out between J.D. Vance, the Vice President, Donald Trump, and President Zelensky as well, essentially saying that President Zelensky is ungrateful for all the money and military assistance that America's given him.
Well, there's actually a dispute over how much America has given. Trump keeps saying 350 billion, and apparently the figure is near 124, 175 billion. Who knows? Presumably the Treasury Department in America. I've got mixed feelings about the press conference. My first view of it was actually when it was forwarded on Telegram, and it had actually been sent from J.D. Vance's Telegram account. So presumably he felt sufficiently okay with his performance that he had put it out on his Telegram account. But the rest of us who are used to watching more polished press conferences were sort of drop-jawed because it was a punch-up. Really, it looked like a punch-up. And so one's initial thought was, well, it rather demeaned the office of presidency. And I felt sad for President Trump and J.D. Vance to some extent that they had spoken to Zelensky like that. On the other hand, what I have since read is that Trump and Vance began to treat Zelensky roughly as soon as he began using the press conference to debate policy positions. So This is actually an article by Jonathan Tobin from the Jewish News Service, and he says Zelensky is used to being shown extraordinary deference as he was by the Biden administration. He's not used to sitting quietly and listening to other positions on the war different from his tough stance without attacking them. In this case, he couldn't help himself and began to lecture Trump and Vance. And they were not only unwilling to put up with that, but prepared to tell Zelensky that he was wrong, and more to the point that he didn't have the cards in these negotiations to tell off his sole superpower ally. So it was sort of political clumsiness on Zelensky's part. If he wanted the security guarantees, he should have secured that outside the press conference, but that wasn't the place to bring it up, and it imploded. And my other thought was, on a much more human level, they were all rather overwrought. I mean, Trump has been going at a tremendous pace for a 78-year-old. He'd had Macron and Starmer in that week already, and here's another head of state, and he's just trying to get stuff done. And Zelensky, of course, is always overwrought because he's been living on not much sleep and probably too much caffeine for 3 years or more.
Yeah, well, you can't blame him with his nation being attacked. And Tim, just share with us your thoughts essentially on the meeting that our Prime Minister had last week in Washington, DC, with President Trump, and how this has resulted in an increase in defence spending. Share with us how important that is, but also now the concern that we might need to increase our defence spending even more if we are going to protect Ukraine and protect Europe from any possible Russian threats.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that in stark contrast to what we've just been talking about, that visit from our Prime Minister, Prime Minister Starmer, was well thought through. It was diplomatically a great success. I think it was, they'd put a lot of work into thinking about how to approach President Trump and the team. And one of the issues, I think, for President Zelensky is that people hadn't done the same homework and so on. I have a lot of sympathy with Zelensky, picking up the point that he's tired, he's emotional, he's drained, he's been fighting this for 3 years, and I do think he was ambushed to a degree, as I say. But I think the Prime Minister played that card very well indeed. And what's interesting is he has, in a way, positioned himself in a very strong position between the EU and America, being able to, as we all keep talking about this special relationship, which I think is true to a degree, but acting as the bridge between the two. Now, part of that conversation and the announcement he made before going to Washington was that we were going to increase our defence expenditure here, which not just President Trump, but presidents of America for the last 20 or 30 years have been saying that Europe has to step up to the mark and increase its defence expenditure. And it's largely been ignored. And countries like Germany and others have been pretty disgraceful, actually, when it comes down to the amount of money they haven't spent on defence over these last decade or so. Now, what the Prime Minister's done is to increase defence expenditure from the current figure, which, depending on how you count the numbers and what you include and so forth, is about 2.3%, and saying he's going to increase it to 2.5% by 2027. So it's still some way off. And he's going to use the aid budget to fund that increase, which surprised many, and to be honest, surprised me. But nonetheless, it is an increase. And that increase is long overdue, but it will take a long time for that to make a real impact. He's also talked about increasing it to 3% by 2030, or not by 2030 necessarily, but by the next Parliament, which could actually be as late as 2033, 2034, depending on when the next election is. Now, spending this money, first of all, there's a lot of holes to fill in our defence. We have been giving a lot of stuff to Ukraine, quite rightly in my view, over the last 3 years. So there's a lot of material, stocks, logistics to fill the gaps of equipment that we've sent. And there are then a lot of other holes that will need filling. The Navy submarine fleet is very expensive and is running over budget. We need more ships. We need more people in the Navy. The Army definitely needs more people to be able to field a high-intensity war-fighting division, or to take on the lead nation responsibility that the Prime Minister is talking about in Ukraine. The RAF need more jets. The F-35s we're buying keep being pushed to the right. So there's lots of areas where we need to see this expenditure going. And we're not actually talking about, I know it's hard numbers, 6 billion sounds a lot of money, but it doesn't buy you an awful lot. And defence industry needs time to ramp up capabilities and set up the production lines, etc. So it's the right move, it's long overdue, and of course Starmer's not responsible for that. We've had 14 years of a Conservative government, leave aside what went on before that. So it's long overdue, but it will take a long time to kick in. But it is the right thing to do. It sends the right powerful message, and it puts him in a position of being able to look other nations in the eye and say, come on, collectively, we've got to do better here. And we've got to start making it clear to America that we are prepared to carry the extra load.
Absolutely. And Melanie, what does it tell us about the times that we're living in, where we have a Labour government wanting to increase or having to increase defence spending? And prior to the election, we also had our former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was actually talking about how, for example, young people need to be able to sign up for military service as well. So this is obviously now transferred from the Conservative government to the Labour government. But share with us how a Labour government is actually increasing defence spending. And we saw that with Prime Minister's questions yesterday of the recording, that Starmer got more cheers from the Conservative backbenchers than he did his own Labour MPs.
Well, he'd got cheers from the Conservatives because he's talking like a Conservative, and he wouldn't have got the cheers from his own side because he is cutting our own foreign aid budget. And it is very ironic, actually, because you'd have thought Labour would be more interested in giving to good causes overseas. One good thing out of that I can see from a Christian perspective is that our foreign aid, the choice of attracting criticism from some Christian organisation, I can name Christian Voice, for example, because they know what's going on in Kenya, that there was strings, sort of sociological strings attached to our foreign aid. In other words, you could have our aid if you birth control or abortions or whatever. So that is actually one advantage. But I can think of many other areas of government wastefulness that they could have taken the money from. I mean, all that we are investing in the green carbon capture, etc., which the scientific basis for that is disputed. And at the art conference 2 weeks ago, I think I mentioned this, Paul Marshall was saying, look, the green policy is going to, the net zero is going to ruin us financially anyway. We've got the most expensive energy in Europe, etc. So it is strange, indeed, for a Labour Prime Minister to be doing this. But one thinks, this is a man who said he preferred Davos to Westminster. So where is he getting his orders from?
Good question, but looks like he's moving the country in the right direction when it comes to defence. Don't know about anything else, but certainly on that one. And so what is your response to many Christians who have fallen hook, line and sinker for a lot of Russian propaganda and believe that Zelensky and Ukraine are the problem, not Putin himself? Because it seems that Putin holds so-called Christian values and is against a lot of this liberal, progressive policies that have been implemented by European governments and other states as well. And this is distorting their viewpoint, ignoring the intelligence as well by Danish intelligence that was reported in the press a couple of weeks ago, that they're saying that Putin is preparing for a major offensive against Europe in either 2026 or 2027.
Yeah, I think, well, there's two or three issues. I go back to what I opened with. The bottom line is we must never lose sight of the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. And therefore, that sovereign state, which has a perfect right to defend itself under international law and the UN and so on, is simply defending itself against Russia. So, I don't disagree that there's lots of wrong within the West in terms of all the sorts of issues we could talk about. But that ultimately is what we're talking about here. And Ukraine has a perfect right to defend itself, and it is not the cause of this problem. Now, in terms of what Russia may or may not do in the future, we must recognize too that Russia has really struggled militarily. It thought it was going to win this campaign very quickly, clearly. It hasn't been able to do that, and its military has proven that it's not as capable as a lot of people thought it was. So the idea that within a couple of years Russia will seriously take on NATO by going into Estonia, Lithuania or Latvia, some talk about linking up the corridor to the Russian enclave in Kaliningrad and so forth. I mean, anything is possible, but I just don't think that's probable. I don't think they are going to want to take on NATO, whatever NATO looks like at that stage. Now, clearly people are talking about NATO breaking apart, but actually I don't believe America is going to pull out of NATO. And the way that the European nations are pulling together and working together, any attempt by Russia to try to do that, would be a big mistake in my view. Of course, intelligence reports are picking up all sorts of stuff of what may or may not follow in the years to come. But Ukraine is not the cause of this problem, and NATO is not the cause of this problem. Ultimately, this is about a Russia under Putin that decided to take back Crimea and various other places and then invade Ukraine. And we need to understand the reality of that and stand up against it.
Absolutely. Melanie, share with us the contrast between President Trump and his predecessor, Joe Biden, that supported the Ukraine with no questions asked. But there seems to be a growing isolationist trend within the Republican administration, particularly the likes of Tucker Carlson. He seems to be taking a kind of pro-Kremlin perspective, and we're seeing a big influence over him, over Trump's administration, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. Share with us your thoughts.
I'd be surprised if Tucker Carlson had that much influence, because he's shown himself to be quite anti-Israel, and that wouldn't go down well with the pro-Israel people in Trump's administration. I think I've learned since the invasion in 2022 from Christians, a sizable number of them, that Ukraine is not it's not whiter than white, might be a whitewashed sepulchre. A prayer leader that I respected said that Ukraine was rotten to the core and is a centre of child trafficking, and we know about the 36 or 39 biosafety labs which Putin could have been worried about. I completely agree with Tim that Russia had no right to invade, but the picture is nuanced, and I think we have to remember that I don't think it's as straightforward as World War II. We would like it to be. There's goodies and baddies on both sides. In terms of the treatment of Ukraine, in contrast to the Biden administration, what had apparently annoyed or not helped Zelensky's case was that he'd been talking to the Democrats beforehand while he was in Washington. So he was sort of almost undermining the Republicans before he came to the Oval Office. I mean, apparently, in the 2024 election, which J.D. Vance brought up, Zelensky had appeared with Pennsylvania's Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro at a munitions plant. They said it was a non-partisan appearance, but the Republicans didn't view it in that way. And also, Zelensky denounced Vance as too radical to be vice president in an interview published in The New Yorker. So that was a slightly unwise move as well. And Zelensky had met with a group of congressional Democrats only hours before his meeting in the Oval Office. And so he really hadn't helped himself. And apparently, before the bust-up in the Oval Office, Trump had been saying that the flow of arms to Ukraine would continue. So I think they're now applying pressure just to bring Zelensky back. And even just today in the news, we have heard that the Prime Minister of Ukraine has said we're ready to sign the minerals deal.
No, absolutely. But talking about this one, that Putin has a history of invading countries, Chechnya, Georgia, and Georgia is a Christian country and invaded that in 2008. So he's got a reputation for doing that. And of course, what he's also done is his military forces have targeted evangelical churches in Ukraine, as well in committing war crimes in Bucha. And other places like that. So, of course, once he rolls over Ukraine, what would then be stopping Putin from marching onto Poland or the Baltic states or retaining those countries that were under control of the Soviet Empire? So I think it's understanding Putin's worldview that we need to then have that moral clarity and realise this is what he's after and this is what he's about. Tim, there's a lot of talk about the future of NATO, certainly over the last couple of days, particularly now that we see that the Trump administration are questioning whether they're going to give security guarantees to any future peace agreement in Ukraine, and with a position of British troops being deployed to Ukraine to keep the peace. Is there a prospect that NATO is in real danger, considering that NATO, ever since really the late 1940s, after the Second World War, has kept the peace in Europe?
Well, there's no doubt that NATO's in trouble, and the 80 years of an assumption of America providing, the bulk of the support, bulk of the money towards NATO, and its commitment to Europe is being undermined. Now, again, to be fair, the previous American presidents, Obama for one, said that America needs to pivot to the Pacific. They're worried about China, they're worried about Taiwan, they're worried about the Chinese influence in the Pacific, and they made that point several years ago. And have been pressurizing again Europe to stand up to the mark by increasing their defense expenditure, to take on more of the heavyweight role in Europe. I don't actually think NATO is about to implode. I don't think America will leave NATO. But Europe has got to step up and spend more, as we've been discussing. What does that look like in the future? I think there will still be Americans based in Europe. They have got large numbers still deployed over here in many, many countries of NATO. And it may well be that they reduce the size and shape of that commitment. But I don't think they're going to be pulling out of Europe completely. Anything is possible, but I don't think it's probable. In terms of what the UK and others stepping up to this, in terms of the Ukraine deployment, I mentioned earlier on, why would Putin come to the negotiating table? But even if he does, one of the points that he and Russia have been making in these last few weeks is they will not accept NATO troops inside Ukraine. So it's all very well talking about UK as a lead nation into a coalition of the willing, which would include France and potentially other European NATO countries. But it's difficult to see Putin accepting the reality of that. We can then come back to the practical realities of trying to deploy a sizable force into Ukraine and what it would be there to do, and we can come back to that, as I say. But I would be surprised if Putin was to simply say, reasonably quickly, that he's going to allow that. He'll want something in return for that, and it's difficult to know what we would be prepared to give him.
Interesting. So we've got less than 2 minutes of the programme, so share with us however difficult this situation is, how we need to be praying, because I think for the first time in a long time, Europe's security is potentially threatened with a very America First based Trump administration, with that very strong isolationist trend flowing right throughout the Republican Party.
I actually think that the Lord has allowed Trump to come into office to give both Israel a respite and Christians to some extent, because when COVID struck, Christians were not ready. We've got to have oil in our lamps, we've got to take the time seriously, and we've got to be ready and have the time of the Lord and be prepared to stand.
Excellent. So 30 seconds left. You've got a prayer that you'd like to read out for us.
So I'm part of a Ukrainian prayer support team. So here's two prayers. One is this: majestic and gracious God, more awesome than the agents of war, more powerful than the wrath of nations, restrain the violence of the peoples and draw the despised of the earth into the joyful life of your kingdom, where you live and reign forever. And God, our deliverer, when the foundations are shaken and justice has departed, defend the poor and needy and give your people strength to fight all wrong in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Amen. Amen to that. So, Melanie and Tim, thank you for doing such a great job on Politics Today. Thank you for watching this programme at home. We seriously do need to pray for our leaders, that they would have wisdom during these dark times that we're living in. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.